Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Erik Aker and Mike Mull. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Hey there, doing okay. Got a bit of a cold, so if I cough, I apologize to our listeners.
Sorry to hear that, Mike. Today, I invited John Benson on the show. John's here to talk about the intersection of law and software. He's an attorney and a hacker, and he's actually been someone who has been an early adopter of LLMs for his work in his legal practices. Welcome, John. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to having a chat with both of you guys.
Now, John, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background?
Sure, I have a an interesting path that I've followed to get to where I am right now. I think if you look at me, I've got a number of different hats or masks that I could possibly wear at any given point. I think a lot of people would look at me as an attorney in some regards because I went to law school, have the law degree, I did 17 years working at a big law firm, one of the biggest law firms in the country. But I also kind of wear the hats of somebody that's a digital native nerd generalist, frankly. I think right. I mean, to describe me as a hacker, I mean, I think that's actually probably perfect, right? I mean, it's my work with technology has always been, for the most part, self-directed. It never really took formal computer classes in college or anything like that, or took what you could get when we were growing up in the 90s out in a small town school district kind of thing. But I didn't take any real formal steps to solidify, certifications or anything like that until I pivoted all the way into getting my digital forensic certification.
Oh, okay. Okay.
To lawyers look at me as almost like a pure nerd, and nerds look at me like almost a pure lawyer.
Oh, so you're like always on the other side of the table for everybody you talk to.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that kind of never necessarily fitting in,
Mm,
but always kind of fitting in everywhere,
hmm
and being able to fit in everywhere is a trait that I've had going back a long time, and I think it's a trait that a lot of people share that are in technology because we kind of gravitate there because of curiosity and excitement instead of necessarily just getting the job done.
So you mentioned digital forensics. What is that in law?
Yeah. So digital forensics, it can be as exciting as it sounds. So really, you're talking about looking at somebody's computer, looking at somebody's phone, and figuring out what happened to it and what happened
Mm.
on it. So, you see things, things on the news about, let's say Alex Jones's text messages or something like that. Or if you've got like a theft of trade secrets case, right, where somebody leaves an employer and they take a thumb drive full of stuff with them. Well, as hopefully people know, you can't do that. Generally speaking, in the U.S., if all that work belongs to the employer, and you can't take that. So when you take it, that's theft of trade secrets. So digital forensics, as I was working in it in that context, involved a whole lot of taking somebody's computer after they'd been terminated, going through, taking a look at what they had done in the times leading up to their departure to see if they had
Oh,
plugged in a thumb drive, to see if they'd
interesting.
emailed themselves, to see if they'd been, you know, sometimes you'd have situations where somebody had gone to work with a competitor. So you'd end up finding evidence that the competitor was conspiring with them to take like customer lists or things like this. It's more of a twist on human investigation inside of digital forensics. The other side of the coin in digital forensics that is very big out there is kind of incident response, which is kind of the malware, information security kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah, sounds real like a kinship, close kinship with hacking. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all very much part of a spectrum. I always found the human element of it to be much more exciting of a chase. The thrill of the chase in forensics and investigation is absolutely real for sure. But I always found that chasing a human scratched more itches for me than trying to reverse engineer how something popped a shell.
Are there companies that investigate everybody who leaves as part of like a compliance program, or is this a case of somebody has to be under suspicion before you look into them?
It kind of depends. For the most part, if people were calling me, they were already at the point that they had some level of suspicion, usually some strong level of suspicion. And I think honestly, it's one of those things where it's so common that if people look, they're probably going to find something. In kind of a post termination situation, you've got your laundry list of policies that you're supposed to do with that computer. But really, that specifically is an issue that I wish companies would deal with more openly and honestly during the offboarding process. Frankly,
Mm.
I mean, I know that it's always those are always awkward and not fun situations, but I definitely ran into a few instances, and then just talking to people out there in the world where people simply flat do not understand that you just can't take a thumb drive with you whenever you go. And I think before somebody walks out that door, if that HR person says, hey, did you take anything with you, and there's this kind of glint in their eye, it would always be helpful if that person kind of looked them square in the face and said, that I know a guy that can tell the make, model, and serial number of every thumb drive that's been plugged into this computer, and can also tell you what you might have been
Mm.
listening to on Spotify while you were copying things off the drive. And you have one more chance to go ahead and put any thumb drives on the table or go home and think about that. I
Mm.
think if it was laid out there just like that, there would be a lot fewer instances where I would have been kind of engaged in those situations. And also, sometimes you get in there and you're like, you see the things happening, and it's like sometimes you're like, because you end up learning a lot about the person when you look at their computer.
Mm.
So you get a sense pretty quickly of like, oh, okay, well, this guy was up to something, or perhaps, oh no, this guy seems totally innocent, kind of thing, and this guy just truly didn't know. That kind of work comes with a lot of ethical quandaries and a lot of kind of cognitive dissonance,
Huh.
because you can imagine with me being in security that or being involved in security and kind of hacking, that I'm always kind of a privacy forward kind of person. And really in the forensics, it's a lot of that kind of work was working you're doing the work of the bad guy after he's broken into your computer kind of thing. The only difference is that I've got permission to do it.
So, John, I'd like to talk a little bit about your use of LLMs and your work with LLMs as an attorney. But before we do that, I feel like we have to give our listeners some sense of what the work of an attorney is traditionally like. When Mike and I and other people who are probably listening to the show think of the work of attorneys, we think of courtroom, legal dramas. They're in the courtroom, but most of the day-to-day work of an attorney is probably not in the courtroom. And what is it like?
The work of an attorney is probably very similar to that of a lot of kind of white collar kind of knowledge workers out there these days. In that you show up at you do a lot of meetings, you do a lot of writing. The legal system and the legal industry, you can kind of fork all lawyers into maybe two different piles if we're going to be a little bit too broad. And you've got litigators on one side, and you've got transactional people on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Litigators would be the people that do the fighting, that handle the courtroom kind of drama, the conflict. But then you've got the transactional folks that are the ones that you call to facilitate you want to go buy a company. How do I go buy a company? You go hire some lawyers and they'll help you write the contracts and
Contracts, yeah.
all of that kind of business end of stuff. So you think of it as there are lawyers that you should look forward to calling because they're helping you build something, and then there's lawyers that you call because you have to. The firm I worked at for a very long time did a lot of both. Big firms, especially, they want to diversify because, as litigation comes and goes, then the transactional side can kind of rise and fall too. But I worked primarily on that litigation side, and it's people I'm sure have a lot of perceptions of what that process looks like based on what you see in popular culture and stuff like this. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that lays out there is that anything in the law happens quickly.
Mm,
Nothing in the law happens fast. One of my favorite shows that is related to legal, not because it's accurate at all because of the legal system, just because of the portrayal of some of the personalities in law firms, was Boston Legal with
Shatner.
William Shatner. Yeah, tremendous TV show. But it always presented litigation as something that you could get through in an afternoon or something like this. That's not the case. That's just not the case. So, trial is something that happens at the very end, and trial is something that is massively expensive, if you can
Mm,
imagine that, right?
mhm,
I mean,
mhm, mhm.
next time you see, somebody, some executive hauled up there in front of Congress or something like that, and you got a bunch of people sitting next to him. You think about the meter that's running during that, right?
Mm.
Everybody, depending on the context, you think about at least every head that's sitting at a table is going to be billing at $350 an hour concurrently, and all those guys are doing is sitting at the table.
Yeah.
So
Never did think about that.
yeah, right. So by the time you get in there and you're going to want to show up, and it's like, oh, we're going to put on a big show and we want a whole AV team and we want 4 paralegals and we want all this. Like, oh well, hell yeah, you got to pay for all that, and you got to put
Hmm.
everybody up in the rooms, and you got to rent all the monitors and run all the cable, and so it's trial is big, it's expensive, it's what you want to avoid, but the litigators are there to do that fight through the system, right? And the system running
Hmm.
up to it.
Well, I guess I was curious too. When I think of the work of attorneys, I think of these massive numbers of boxes of mysterious documents inside, the whole thing about discovery. And there's a lot of text to read and
Uh-huh.
synthesize, right? And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit too, as a part of the work of an attorney.
Yeah, well that actually was where the bulk of my work at the big firm was before was, I would do the digital forensics at kind of that micro level.
Hmm.
But then my broader role was handling e-discovery. And e-discovery is kind of forensics at a macro level, at almost an institutional level, you can think of it. So discovery, when two companies sue each other or two individuals sue each other in the States, both parties are obligated to share documents and share evidence with the people on the other side in advance so that everybody's operating on a level playing field whenever you get into court, whenever you're trying to present all this evidence to whoever's gonna make a finding of fact, right? Gonna
Hmm.
make a judgment call one way or the other. And if you go deep enough back into the common law system, it didn't used to be like that. It did end up being a little bit more like you would see on TV, where you would have surprise evidence and the shocking kind of witness kind of thing at the end.
Hmm.
That kind of, I think it was there might have even been a Latin phrase for it, but it called the trial by surprise kind of thing. And the U.S. court system changed that over time. So now we exchange stuff, and that's a big deal if you're a big company. It's a big deal even if you're one individual and you're just talking about text messages and email,
There's
right?
probably a lot of stuff, right? A massive,
Oh, we're
and actually,
talking
it seems
about,
like
oh yeah, you're talking about terabytes and petabytes of text at an increasing rate every single year. Absolutely.
I have this image in my head of people wheeling in file boxes full of paper.
me too.
Is that like a thing of the past that's just used for TV now, or is everything digital now?
Oh, that's an interesting transition. I think it depends on the case, the attorney, and everything like that. When I started practicing in 2006 or so, we were still very much in a transition where you'd work with some senior partners that had preferences where they'd say, oh, pull all the key documents and I want them to be put in chronological order and put them in binders. which is a lot of work, and
Hmm.
also something that makes a lot of sense that you'd want to see something like that. But also, if you've got a computer screen and a database there, and you can just click and then it sorts everything, then the alternative seems a little bit antiquated. So what happened was over time, everything has moved towards being kind of digital first. It is all living in databases. The software that runs the stuff has gotten bigger, it's gotten better, it's gotten more capable.
Is there law specific software that you're talking about there, John? Like specific
Ye-
applications that law firms run or they pay for?
Yeah, there are, and those pieces of software, what it does is it's not that much different than iTunes,
Mm,
frankly. So what happens is you take a raw document, let's say like a Word document, and you run it through one piece of processing software, and it's gonna extract all the metadata, it's gonna extract all the text and put it into a singular field in a database so it can be indexed. And then it gets all put into a larger database that shows you a picture of the document on one side, kind of like the underlying MP3 and iTunes back in the day. And then it'll show you all the metadata. And then the work of the attorney, right? The work of an attorney that's working in discovery, especially if they're a young associate, they're not being wheeled boxes of documents to pour through like they were back in the 80s.
hmm.
They're logging into a review queue, and they're going to sit there and they're going to look at somebody else's email or somebody else's Word document and say, okay, that document is related to this case or it's not. It's related to this issue that somebody else mentioned in this case. It did not come from an attorney, so it's not privileged. And then they make those 5 or 6 clicks, and they click the save and next button, and then they go
Wow.
on to the next document.
How many documents do you think that they're reviewing in a day? Or I don't know. That doesn't sound that efficient, I guess, is what I want to say.
But it's not. No, it's not. You can effectively, depending on what kind of documents you're looking at, really a human can get through roughly 60 docs an hour.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay.
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 And that's moving at a pretty decent clip. And that's making
Yeah.
some assumptions about, what's in that document, if it's a spreadsheet or if you've got to do what's called redaction, right? If there's something in there that you're allowed to black out,
Mm,
either because it's privileged or because you've agreed with the other side that we're just gonna be able to do this. More personally identifiable information. That kind of
mm,
stuff will slow you down because now instead of just clicking and kind of classifying documents, now you're drawing boxes on the screen like the world's
mm.
worst version of Command and Conquer. Um, and yeah, fun fact, I actually did that job after law school. I finished law school during one of the first, in the grand scheme of things, it was a small economic blip, but a small economic blip for the local legal profession. And I ended up doing document review for, oh goodness, probably 10 months, I think. And it's as bad as it sounds. No,
It
it's
doesn't
absolutely
sound
as
very
bad as it
fun.
sounds.
It
Yeah,
doesn't sound very fun.
it's not fun, and it's not. It sure as hell isn't why people go to law school. And the quality and the accuracy that comes out of it is really obviously not all that great either. You're
Yeah.
talking the statistics around that are there are studies that go back into like the 70s and some into the early 80s about accuracy and precision,
Hmm.
which are the same, kind of data science terms that we in statistical terms that we use today for measuring the effectiveness of LLMs or AI systems generally. But it took a look at how good are paralegals at this, or how good are senior attorneys at this. And when you were looking at humans doing the work alone in kind of a serial fashion, even when they knew they were being looked at, really they're only, call it maybe 40-50% accurate at
Oh,
best.
okay. That's even higher than I was.
At,
So,
yeah, yeah, I'd say they at best. And your presumption is probably to be there or lower is probably accurate.
I guess I would imagine that if I'm in one of these cases and maybe it's going to go to litigation, and maybe my strategy is I'm going to send over to the other attorneys, the other side, I'm going to send over just a a huge flood of documents,
Hmm.
and
Oh,
that might make
sure.
it that makes their job even harder. How do you know that you found the real gold nuggets in there? It seems like it'd be so easy to overlook stuff. It's such a massive volume of information.
It is. And there are a lot of different factors that roll into deciding if and when, and maybe even to a degree, what you're looking at. And one of the blind spots that exists within, I think, the e-discovery industry, and I think really from almost anybody that looks at legal through a purely technological lens, we make this presumption that, well, we're doing e-discovery, and therefore every piece of evidence and every piece of knowledge needs to come out of this database, and we're doing this totally blind, right? That it's a single source of everything. And in reality, you do have humans, right? You still have a human that's going to get on the phone and be like, "Oh no, this is the key guy," so it's going to help you filter on that. So
Hmm.
this kind of concept of document review and that kind of document analysis, there's a review of the documents in that kind of a serial way to say whether it's related to the case or not. And that's kind of review for obligation and to decide what goes out versus what gets retained.
Hmm.
But then there's the other aspect of, yeah, there's this expensive nonsense that's going on over here, but I also need to go win my case, right?
Hmm.
So when you are trying to go in there and win your case and find those other things, it's a question of it's a different mindset that you approach, and to a degree a different tool set. And in e-discovery, it's a different way that we apply the AI technology
Oh,
between
okay.
those two different tasks.
Okay, I want to get to that
Um,
soon here. I think Mike had a question he wanted to jump in with.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if, with all this data, if modern law firms need sort of the equivalent of data
Hmm.
engineers,
oh boy.
people building pipelines.
Um, Boy, the question, people have been trying to answer the question of what law firms need for a long time. And a lot of people have come up with things that both they think that law firms need and that law firms actually need.
Hmm.
Lawyers, I think, are a very unique social group in that they don't always necessarily adopt the things that are necessarily good for them in all instances very quickly.
Hmm.
So the legal profession generally, it depends on the sector, right? I mean, you're going to have certain areas where law firms and lawyers are highly incentivized to use technology that makes them the most efficient and the most effective, right? So think about a plaintiff's firm, right? Somebody that you hire because let me think about a random company. Let's just say you went out and worked for Hallmark, let's say, okay, and you go work for Hallmark and you get fired. Well, Hallmark's going to have a big law firm and they've got all kinds of documents. You've got a small one-man shop law firm, right? Or you've got me, for example, and I'm just one dude. And suddenly here comes, 2 million documents that all relate
Hmm.
to the policies related to something or else. Right? It's like right now I'm at a strategic disadvantage. And historically, I've always been at a historical disadvantage because I just have fewer resources, both in terms of humans, in terms of technology. But that smaller guy, he's going to take that on. The bigger guys, there's almost power in the inefficiency, and there's power to be wielded through that scale.
Wow.
So, a large firm and large institutions that are looking at this kind of thing, whether it's with kind of malicious or specific intent or not, are still going to look at this in terms of we still have an advantage. We want to retain that advantage by sticking to potentially inefficient means of getting this done so that we can continue to have leverage over smaller people on the other side.
Oh, interesting. I think there's kind of a nuts and bolts question underneath Mike's question, which is like, how do you
Hmm.
actually get all this information into your database? Like, well, how does it get transferred? How does it get handed over? Are there tools and technologies? You have to hire people. You have like specialized roles just to sort of manage the massive movement of documents for every single case you take on. What's it look like?
Absolutely. It has always been the collection and preservation of data has been always a real thorn, practically and legally. Luckily, that is actually getting easier, while at the same time getting harder and more complicated.
Hmm.
When I started, almost any case, even whether you're talking about international corruption or you're talking about, a dispute between two neighbors about whether the fence got put in the right spot,
Hmm.
almost any of those, when you get down to an individual level, we're always going to be talking about, hey, we're going to grab your email, we're going to grab your text messages, we're going to grab your loose documents, we're going to grab a catch-all of crap that lives on the web, and then we're going to talk about paper,
Hmm.
right? Where things get hard is, how do you take that email and get it from where it is today over to where I am now, and then into my magic pipeline that puts
Hmm.
it into the database.
Hmm.
Before, that was a lot of interfacing with client technology staff, and that was another role that I played, and one that I played fairly well, because I can speak through the lens of legal, but also through the lens of technology.
Hmm.
And there are kind of bulk approaches. You can either do something as ham-fisted as just going in and collecting PSTs from everybody and then searching everything, but that sucks. But depending on the case, you may be able to do something that's more targeted, yet every bit as defensible in the eyes of the court. So
Hmm.
you and I could sit down and hop on a Zoom meeting, and I'll just sit there, and you and I'll talk through your case, and I'll help you folder your email, compress all your stuff, get it all over to me so that the timelines and everything like that works. I've
Okay.
been involved, you've been supervised. I know that you didn't hide the ball,
Hmm.
and therefore that's going to be good enough. Therefore, I'm only collecting what I need. But really, the move to 365 has been the biggest change for a positive, I think, in terms of companies being able to respond to litigation.
You're talking about
Because
Microsoft tools in particular, is that right? Microsoft Suite?
exactly. And not necessarily because Purview or whatever they're going to call the email export suite today, the name changes just constantly. Um, it's not necessarily that that's good, but at least everybody is in kind of a uniform system. So if I call up a client, nine times out of ten they're gonna tell me, oh, we're on 365 or we're in Google
Oh, okay.
Workspace, and
Okay.
I'm no
Okay.
longer dealing with, well, we still run GroupWise and it's behind these different kinds of systems, but there was this vendor that came by a few years ago and he sold us this email archiving system, and it's been running. We don't really know what it is, but you can go look at that. And then you realize, oh, well, you guys set that up outside the spam gateway, so that's actually like 20 terabytes of mostly spam.
Jeez.
Um, had that happen
Oh, wow.
before. So yeah, there's a lot of complicated stuff, and so even and as some technologies have made things easier, like email has gotten easier, other technologies become more difficult, like short messaging, right? Either
Oh,
on phones or in
SMS,
Teams and stuff like this.
Slack.
Slack, because the volume is high, the data formats are cloud based. They're definitely not documents, you
Hmm.
know? And all of these kinds of database systems and all of these models that we have for taking those kinds of native things that we interact with day to day and then turning it into what gets waved around in a courtroom.
Hmm. Hmm.
Things like text messages are just fundamentally different, and there's different kinds of metadata and different things that you've got to think about. Like, how do you decide whether if you've got a Word document, you know where a Word document starts and ends. But if you and I are texting in an email chain, how do I split that up? Do I do it on a time basis? Do I do it on an arbitrary basis? It kind of
Hmm.
depends. You don't really necessarily know.
Hmm.
And from a practical perspective, you get in there and you've got a couple choices. I could either put in every text message I've ever had with my wife into one single PDF, and then we could pay an associate to go draw up boxes on the screen.
Hmm.
That doesn't sound very fun. Or break it up individually and do it page by page. I mean, it's just it's an exercise in compromise and and suffering.
That's interesting. So it's like the
Really.
idea we have of these things, they don't cleanly mesh onto the metaphor of this is a document in a court case.
That's right. That's right. And our methods of communication are moving so much faster than I would almost call it like almost the waste management system
Mm,
of discovery, right? The software and the platforms aren't necessarily equipped to handle the new stuff that's coming in.
mm,
It's
mm,
finally pretty great and pretty great at email, and it's pretty great at handling Word documents.
mm,
Um, and we finally got there, and call it 2010.
mm-hmm. And
Um,
then the world changed.
oh yeah, but or it had already changed, and the lawyers were like, "Hooray, we finally got Word documents figured out," and and
Hmm.
and we've moved on.
Yeah.
Um, I had instances where you got to produce everything in PDF. Well, here's a PDF that has a 3D model in it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You know, well,
So,
what do I do with that? So it's layers.
so you've mentioned LLMs a few times, and I reached out to you because of the people I know whose work a little bit familiar with. You seem like you've been working with LLMs longer than almost anybody I've talked to. When did you start using these tools, and what were the early problems you started trying to apply them to, if you remember?
Yeah, that's I've had a long path with LLMs, but also AI generally. In legal, we've been trying to leverage predictive algorithms and predictive machine learning techniques for quite some time to make us more accurate and more precise. But those are
Hmm.
very different than large language models. And that's part of the thing. I think almost anybody now out there talking to anybody in AI, you get a lot of the more seasoned folks that have been in machine learning and took statistics, high level statistics before the Obama administration, and they'll talk about how they've been doing AI forever. And yeah, that's true. I've been, I guess, to a degree doing AI forever, but really there's two kind of generations. There's that, and then there's LLMs. So LLMs kind of entered my world just like it did just everybody else whenever ChatGPT, I think 3.5 came out. And I was fairly skeptical at first. I kind of got in, and I got in an argument with ChatGPT, and I found it to be. I put it through the paces of that a lot of people did, and I was like, oh wow, this is really smart. And then I'd push it on legal topics, and I'd be like, oh okay, I could see how that's that'd pass a bar exam question. I can see that, but let me push it a
Hmm.
little bit harder, and then as soon as I really started working inside of my circle of competence,
Hmm.
that was when the shine kind of started to wear off. And that was at the early stages where people weren't necessarily sure what it was going to be good for or not good for. And I got kind of busy and kind of just put all that on the shelf for a little while. That was when you had people like Michael Cohen, the former attorney for the I guess he's I've been fairly out of the news. I'm assuming he's still
Oh, is
president.
it Trump's
Um,
fixer? That was what they called him.
yes,
Trump's fixer in the news.
yes, exactly, exactly. He decided that he was going to do a little bit of legal research and had cited some cases that didn't exist because of the LLM hallucinated.
Mm,
And of course, as soon as I saw these things, just like, oh, it's only a matter of time before some bozo comes along and ruins this for everybody. And lo and behold, it happened to be that bozo in particular, which was like, wow, um, how can we get Anthony Weiner involved in this too? Um, and so I kind of let it sit, and then the following fall. I had been asked by the local bar, who I do a lot of speaking for, to give a talk on LLMs, and I was still kind of grouchy, and I was still pretty skeptical about it. And I actually said, "Heck yeah, this will give me an excuse to get in here. I'll play with some of this stuff."
mm,
And and is in a thing that's fairly typical, I think, for me and a lot of people with that kind of hacker mindset, and was definitely reflected in the first couple of years once AI was out there in the hacker community. Was, oh well, this is great. Now I'm here to show that I'm smarter than these bozos. and show everybody that this stuff is nonsense and needs to go away. And I got in, and instead of working with ChatGPT, I started working with Claude. I knew nothing about Claude other than it happened to be the LLM that was in part backing Notion's AI system, which I'd
Mm.
started using at work.
Okay.
And I'd been impressed. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. This is at least a little bit more interesting than what I was getting out of ChatGPT 6, 8 months ago. So I started kind of playing with Claude. And I started truly from scratch. And I think my first thread with Claude really started with "Hi there." At that phase, really, there's a lot of stuff out there now about prompt engineering and a lot of materials out there to get you going. There were some things out there at that time, but really, for the most part, it was raw experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody kind of knew really the way that things were going to work or how they were going to work. And a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation. For example, Claude would do things like if I tried to write a Python script with it, it would confidently come back at the time and say, oh, well, this code ought to work. I spun up a Docker VM and I ran it and it should be fine. So just go ahead and copy and paste it.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely at that time, and this is how raw I started with going in, I'm like, well, let me double check. Is that a thing that Claude can do? And like I'd check their actual documentation and be like, is this a feature that has been rolled out? And I'm like, no, that is still at that point was still mostly science fiction. No, it's
So
not, right?
it's just confidently saying, I ran this code. You can trust it.
Oh
But it
yeah,
didn't.
no, to the point that if I went back in my search history, shit, I was looking, I was trying to figure out what version of Python that Claude was running so that I could make sure I was running the same consistent environment. Which also was a good illustrator for me at the beginning of how how confident it can be and how to a degree how misleading it can be. So I continue to work with it and I continue to be more kind of amazed over time. And I think I just kind of sit there at night chatting with it on my phone. And I got into a conversation with Claude that was interestingly enough that it hit the daily limit. And it's like, well, you're done until tomorrow, or you could pay $20 and keep this going.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat there probably over the course of a couple nights, and I'm like, man, $20, that's a lot. Hell, Netflix is 9. And I'm like, okay, well, I got this talk. I'll go ahead and throw $20 at it. I'll treat it like a business expense. It'll be fine. But then just kind of kept going. And then I started to see what it would do because it kept impressing me and challenging me. And I found that it was that as I talked to it, it would engage in conversations and it was more steerable. And one of the biggest moments for me was when just through experimentation, I was like, well, let me just take some raw output from Nmap. Okay, you guys know what Nmap is, right? The network port scanner,
Yeah.
maybe. Okay,
Sort of. I mean, yeah,
um,
we do, but
it's a
give
it's
a
a
give a
yeah
quick little description.
it's a basic network security tool or network engineering tool, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that will just take a look at from your computer. It'll send out kind of like sonar. It'll reach out and figure out what ports are open on a computer on the other end,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll give you a little report. You get IP addresses and what happened. And I I opened up a new Claude thread and I said, "Hey Claude, I just found this on a laptop there was a laptop sitting in the office, and I found this. I'm going to paste this in. You tell me what the hell this is." And it interpreted it line by line. I was like, "Wow, that's really good." And this was also at a time where one of the memes everybody would do is, let's have it do something in a funny way. So I
Mm-hmm.
go like,
Mm-hmm.
well, why don't you narrate that log file essentially in the form of calling a horse race, like you're calling the Kentucky Derby.
Hmm.
And it did it, and I was like, that's hilarious, but also, oh my God, accurate.
Hmm.
So then I pulled the usual, well, explain it like a 5-year-old. I'm like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that actually works really well to 5-year-old. And then I said, huh. And I did something that was uncomfortable. And I said, why don't you do a report on this from a digital forensics perspective and an incident response perspective and tell me what happened here and what people inside of management might need to be concerned about? And it did it
Hmm.
instantly, and it was
Hmm.
good.
Tell me
And
why that. Tell me why that was uncomfortable.
well, I say it's uncomfortable. I think it's something that a lot of people will walk up to the LLM because they have this fear of, is it going to replace me,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Or is it going to take my job?
Hmm.
And you walk up with with that kind of sense that I had initially of, I'm going to walk up and I'm going to poke it and I'm going to find reasons to avoid this scary thing. And taking that raw output and turning it into human readable and human understandable prose or explanation was something that set me apart from the lawyers. It's what
Mm.
set me apart from the digital forensics people,
That
right?
was your specialty,
Even
right? This is a differentiator for you.
yeah, and not even just necessarily a specialty. It was a core to my being thing
Mm.
that made me unique and special and made me feel like it was what I brought to the world and it was what I brought to the situation,
Wow. Okay.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what happens is I sit there and I watch this robot that is either free or $20 do my job, not only just my job, but what made me great at my job better than me. And that's a point where you do kind of sit down and say, shit, now what? Because on one hand you've got this sense of fear, but then you also get loaded up with this, oh my God, I might have just been the first person to figure this out. How many other people have figured this out?
Well,
And how quickly do I need to figure this out before I am made worthless? Or do I need to go and raise alpacas? It's that kind of a moment.
can I ask though? Because when you were talking about the Python script, it came back and it said to you, "I ran this in a Docker container and it works." And you're trying to figure out what Python version. And there's the potential for confident yet inaccurate answers. So it did this particular job really well, but you were able to review it. If it can do your job without you, and you're talking about, wow, did this make me obsolete? It's hard for me to imagine that you wouldn't need someone to review that output to make sure that it's correct, to make sure that it's appropriate.
I think that's absolutely the case, and that's still going to be the case. I think going forward for a lot of different things. You're
Hmm.
going to want the human in the loop. You're going to want those kind of human connections. You're going to want those kinds of organic things, those organic components added to things over time. But there's a lot of stuff that we can take care of that's kind of first level review, right? Think about that. Think about back to e-discovery and that kind of
Hmm.
document by document kind of thing. You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
you're going to want a human to sit there and craft the argument that you're going to file as as the complaint, right?
Hmm.
Or your
Hmm.
big briefs. But is there a reason that you need to be? Because we didn't talk about how much we pay those people to review documents at 60 documents per hour,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Hmm.
if you're paying an associate at a law firm, you're paying potentially the same as you would for them sitting at trial looking pretty, right? So, $350 an hour. You can do the
Hmm.
math on that.
Hmm.
Everybody's
Hmm.
better served by delegating that right now to something that is faster, more accurate, everything like that, so we can focus on a lot of those other kind of human element kinds of deals.
That's interesting.
So when I came out of that, that was a little bit of my conclusion was, yeah, this thing can do this better than I can, this core thing. But what can I take away from this is well, I can now take this and I'm going to make sure that my next step in the path is being able to drive this robot better than anybody else, be
Hmm.
first there. before I want to replace somebody else before somebody replaces me.
I was thinking you started all this work because you were going to give a talk to your local bar association, you
Yeah,
said. I'm curious
yeah.
what that talk, how it was received. So what was the message you gave to that room, and what was the feedback you got from the attorneys in that room? Were they as scared as you were? Did you tell them this thing's coming for a chunk of your job, you better be ready? What did you tell them?
Well, that seeing that moment and then continuing to work on that talk, the talk ended up being the big kind of capstone. So once I saw that, I approached the talk from the aspect of ethics, illegal ethics, and AI. You can imagine there's not a shortage of content discussing AI and legal, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
there's a real shortage of stuff that is hands-on, that's really informed by knowledge and really kind of deep research and work into it. And I took that long period and went back into the principles, and what I ended up presenting was kind of a model for evaluating each LLM technology and how effective it can be, whether it can be relied on, when it can be relied on, based on really in addition to things like statistics, but also what people see. Because we do get wrapped up so much in verifiability that we can also often lose sense of just you can look at something and tell if it's true or not, or
Hmm.
accurate or not.
Erik and I have been having this discussion with some friends of ours about sort of the point at which human judgment becomes important in certain
Hmm.
processes. I think we have sort of a varying takes on it, but it seems like it's really important in the legal profession. So I was looking in the news yesterday. I saw this company that is trying to automate the whole process of granting patents,
Hmm.
or at least doing the research for patents. And my sense of that is okay. That's acceptable because the consequences of making a mistake are relatively low risk. But it seems like there's inevitably going to be this push toward, let's let the AIs adjudicate cases, or let's, for small claim stuff, let's just have the
Hmm.
AI do it. Do you have any thoughts on like where we should stop letting the computers
Hmm.
make decisions?
I don't know that there is a good stopping point. I think more these days in terms of trends and waveforms than points and definitions for lots of different reasons. But the way you put it is very apt. The more that you are delegating a decision, and the more you're delegating something that's going to have an impact on somebody else, the more oversight and the more human involvement needs to be there.
Hmm.
There's a sense, I think, especially from people with a technical background, that the law is an imperfect system. And let's say you take the whole jury system, right? I mean, we find facts and we define truth to a degree through the lens of 12 random people that couldn't figure out how to get out of jury duty. And that method of finding truth and fact for people that live their lives in a world that's defined at the lowest level by 0 or 1 is kind of hard to swallow. And it's also one that can be tempting to say, we do want to delegate things like the finding of facts to something like an algorithm.
Hmm.
But even without discussing things like bias and all of those other things, I think it's important that we always maintain that human element, especially when it is having a human impact. There's an element, even if you take a look at viscerally red light cameras. Red light cameras have been around with and have had different legal treatments depending on where you are, because There's no person there. I'm getting this ticket, and I'm supposed to go into court, and I'm supposed to face my accuser. And my accuser is this camera that just took a picture.
Mm,
In lots of jurisdictions, people just said that's constitutionally that's not how we roll. So even if we correct for all of the issues of bias and stuff like that, it's something that makes me fundamentally uncomfortable, and
mm,
I think should make a lot of people uncomfortable as well.
yeah.
One of the challenges when you're talking about AI broadly is that the way that you apply the technology is so different, and it can mean so many different things. One of the places that I had the privilege of sitting in the past year was at a thing called the Sedona Conference, which is kind of it's a think tank for legal technology, and has been around for a long time. A lot of judges, a lot of people from industry, and a lot of thought leaders sitting around having good discussions at a place where you're not there kind of merely to puff up your ego and go
Mm,
have drinks on the vendor at the end.
hmm hmm
But you've got people in that room, and it was part of the AI working group, and I watched, and since I had a new job, I didn't have any other email to have to pay attention to, so I was actually fully engaged for the entire room the whole time. And you'd have people talk about the issue of bias in AI and bias in algorithms, which is a big, big, big deal. And you would have people talking back and forth and people issuing a counterpoint, and they would be appearing to have a good conversation. But then if you listen closely, you'd realize that one person was talking about AI classification in terms of like facial recognition. And the other person was talking about AI in terms of doing document review, right?
mm,
So
mm,
the discussion of bias in terms of is this camera system going to flag somebody as being suspicious, right? That kind of a decision is going to be more impacted by something involving bias historically in that model than say me taking ChatGPT and saying, "Hey, ChatGPT, is this email related to the sale of this house or not?"
hmm
Right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that second one sounds easier for me to accept, but
yes.
I still can't get over this. Maybe it's because I'm reacting to some of the marketing of these tools or some of the
Hmm.
enthusiasm I see where people say they're just going to get better and better. And they either explicitly say or they're implying eventually they're going to be so good, they'll take our jobs. And that means they're going to work independently. But even in like your discovery example, or I mean, I can make a dumber example. It's like, I have no idea about contract law. I'm not an attorney. I could go and ask LLM to write a contract for me. That's going to be tested someday if I ever have to go and have a court case around it. And at that point, it's almost kind of a worthless document, right? Like, I don't know the value of that thing unless I have an expert to review the output of the tool.
Hmm.
And even with discovery, it seems like you still need someone to review and go, yes, yes, you did discover something that is definitely linked to the case. So you always have to
Hmm.
have the expert involved. That's my concern with even these sort of more minimal examples. I didn't mean to detour from your point about bias, though, John.
No, I did. You're. That's a good transition too, because it's especially for those of us in areas where we have specific expertise. The lawyers in particular are obviously going to feel squirrely about somebody getting legal advice from ChatGPT, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A therapist is going to get squirrely about somebody talking to ChatGPT about mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there are issues that people get worried about there related to accuracy. But there's also issues in there related to, kind of those bigger concerns about taking my job and stuff like that. So it's all kind of wrapped up in there together. The interesting thing is that as these things do get better and better, and as those of us who are professionals do continue to rely on these more and more, it becomes harder to tell people to treat everything that comes out of an LLM as being inherently untrustworthy. The difference here I make is this, I sit here getting ready to launch the e-discovery and AI consulting company. I'm using ChatGPT to draft all my operating agreements. It's going to handle all of that kind of back office stuff.
Hmm.
And I'm very confident in the output for a couple different reasons. One reason is that I'm confident in the techniques that I use, so that I know that when ChatGPT gives me something, what it gives me is informed by good primary sources and is likely to be very much mostly accurate. But I also have that other kind of gloss of I'm also an attorney, so I can proofread this to make sure that it's not grossly inaccurate.
Hmm.
Okay? Then we have issues of if you are a novice, right? Or let's say you're somewhere in the middle and you're trying to decide and you don't know whether or not this is good or it is not. One of the questions in my mind as we evaluate the kind of ethics of this decision is, is that information better than the alternative of having no information at all,
Hmm.
or what you had to turn to before? So, in the legal context, or let's talk about maybe financial advice. Okay. So, let's say you're going to go out and buy a car. Are you more likely to get good advice on how to buy a car and how to avoid getting swindled by asking ChatGPT or by calling, Joe's Hot House of Car Loans? Because Joe over at Hot House of Car Loans, I mean, he's a human. He'll give you something. He'll give you something that's going to land you in bankruptcy. But ChatGPT is going to give you something that's probably pretty good.
Hmm.
So, it opens up resources to people that were under resourced before, that gives them information that is way, is extremely close to professional grade and they can rely on. The other issue, the area there that I think is also very touchy, where you've got professionals with very big, serious, and real concerns, is also there with kind of mental health. And what the LLM gives you in terms of all of it, and I think that whether you are a well-resourced person or a person that is turning to ChatGPT for advice, guidance, input on stuff where you might consult a professional, it's going to at least prepare you better for a conversation with that eventual professional.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
frankly, it will give you a different perspective and perhaps a perspective that you hadn't considered.
Hmm.
And there are instances where that need of an independent perspective is actually fairly important.
Oh, that's interesting.
One of the things I've gone through recently is this is a funny experience because the reactions have been all over the map. I was diagnosed with ADHD for the first time at 44 years old, so I got to where I am today while swimming uphill against being neurodivergent and not knowing it.
Hmm.
Right, you end up seeing these kinds of things on like TikTok, right? And I would see these things on TikTok going back. It's just like, oh, why is this thing talking to me about ADHD? I resonate with all of this, but holy hell,
The
if I go into
algorithm
my
is
doctor,
diagnosing you.
well, that's exactly right. But then you also know that, it's what everybody talks about. So you
Hmm.
sure as hell can't walk into your doctor's office, or at least in my mind at that time, for a very long time. It's like, well, I can't walk into my doctor's office and say, can we have a conversation about ADHD because I saw videos on TikTok?
Hmm. There's
That
not a lot of
that seems
credibility in that question. Yeah.
exactly, and you feel, and I felt at least like if I lead off with that, I'm gonna get shown the door as
Hmm.
being either an idiot or who knows, even worse, right? Oh well, this is now
Hmm.
drug seeking behavior, so we're going to put
Hmm.
down a mark in his deal. It turns out I do have ADHD. get confirmed by multiple psychiatrists at this point and my GP. And then
Hmm.
as I started telling people about that, either way, though, it would have gotten you in and having that conversation. I think even if somebody is there right now and they're like, oh, well, TikTok says I might have ADHD, but I don't want to go talk to somebody. I would say that if you go talk to somebody and if you go to a therapist or your doctor and they say, well, just because you heard about it on TikTok, these things that resonate with you are then not true. So get out. That's not a doctor and that's not a therapist you should be seeing.
So I have a question going back to the LLMs.
Hmm.
I've heard this phrase that the LLMs can't tell you things that nobody knows, but they can tell you things that you don't know.
Hmm.
So if you're like analyzing something in a legal context and the LLM points at something that you might not have pursued otherwise, does the output of the LLM then become part of the legal record?
No, no, it doesn't. That issue of work product and whether or not kind of who owns the output of that in terms of both ownership, but then also who can claim privilege on it. Let's say you and I are going to have a meeting, right? I'm your lawyer, and we're going to prep for the same meeting. You and I have pop into Claude, and we happen to type in the exact same queries. My conversations, if somebody looked at my computer, well, that's all work product because I'm a lawyer. Well, you might be out there just Joe Blow. That's not privileged, and the other side can see all of that. It's tricky questions that are in there for sure, for sure. But in terms of like just the idea, I mean, no, I mean the attorney can take that, and it's that perspective I think that that attorneys are eventually going to really like with all of this kind of thing because you don't have to just get the perspective of the individual LLM, right? When you know how to drive the LLM, and this is some of the stuff why Erik, I think, it wanted to talk about the LLM specifically, is that you can tune that thing that in a single thread you can get multiple perspectives, independent perspectives that are useful, and you can learn tons just by engaging on any given subject and going at it with the specific purpose of gaining additional perspective.
So I think that gets to really the last question that I wanted to try to approach, John. This is the hardest one. If you put your crystal ball on the table, what do you think the job of the future attorney is going to look like? Are they going to be using these tools in the future? And what's that day to day work going to be like that's different from how it is now?
Boy, that is it's simultaneously a harder question to answer for the legal sector specifically than, but also easier to answer than the rest of the world, I think. The impact of LLMs and LLM's ability to act as that kind of co-pilot and act as that accelerator to level that playing field. Remember when we were talking about, the solo plaintiff's attorney taking on the big corporation? It used to be one of the reasons that you would join a big firm was because you needed the resources around you to accomplish the work that you
Hmm.
wanted to do, right? You want to go fight corruption, then you've got to go work for a firm that's got enough resources to go fight corruption. And often that could even come with other trade-offs. You've got to do, well, if I got to work for a company that does that kind of work, then they also represent petrochemical industry, which is kind of gross. But I'm really here for the
Hmm.
corruption. The technology now truly it brings back the potential for people to be independent counselors to people in a way that it hadn't been before. I think the solo practitioners, the small firm guys are the ones that are presently the biggest winners in this. I look at big law firms and I look at big industries and big business models. A lot of those big firms are built around models of the billable hour.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, maybe one thing that is different about software development than legal is that we still cling so much to that billable hour output. Right now, you want to do big document review, you can scale it at 60 documents an hour per person, and then you've got to go find people. With a language model, I can take 1 million documents and I can have ChatGPT review 500,000 documents over the weekend. And the cost differences are so bananas. I mean, you're talking about 90% reductions in cost to the actual client in terms of document review when you're doing it with an LLM versus having an associate do it at a big firm.
So you're saying that legal services are going to be a lot less expensive very soon. That's what you're saying.
I think, well, yes and no. Yes, I think that's true. I think that's very true for companies, and I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing for everybody, right? I mean, you think about those. Yeah, we're talking about job replacement and kind of role replacement here, and we're talking about big firms and big associates and stuff like this. But also remember what that work looks like. You know, there are a lot of people with a lot of
Mhm.
knowledge and a lot of things that they can bring to the world that are currently spending their time reading other people's email. It would be good if we can let those people go and go do something else, because I think even at a big law firm, those associates, they'll go find something else to do. You know, the discovery and legal
Mhm.
will be
Mhm.
it's one of my friends put it is said that it's like a gas, right? I mean, it will expand to fill the container that it sits in,
Oh,
regardless. You
okay.
know, and as that
Mhm.
associate's going to find something to
Mhm.
do, and he doesn't want to do that job anyway, right? So,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
where we embrace, so legal will be well served, and it's going to be fundamentally changed, especially at the bigger scale level, through the leveling
Mhm.
of this by making this good technology available to level the playing field in terms of like litigation and litigants.
I think it's something that we are anticipating. We're hearing a lot about changes in software, law, health, and it's hard not to wonder where things are going to go.
Yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to Mike and I today. It really has been great listening to your experience and listening to you describe how you're using these tools. And I think I've learned a lot about law and potentially changes to the legal profession in years to come. Really appreciate you coming on and talking to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
So this has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. We'll see you again next week.
See you next time.
Bye bye.